All right, hounds of history, purity sleuths, and anyone who's ever looked at a gold standard and smelled a lead-lined rat. Welcome back, and today we're diving headfirst into a toxic soup, a chilling comparison that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about progress. We're pitting the murky waters of Victorian London against the recent and far from resolved nightmare in Flint, Michigan. The core question? When authorities know the water you're drinking is essentially slow-acting poison, do they rush to warn you? Or do they tell you to quote-unquote keep calm and carry on drinking? Spoiler alert, the answer isn't reassuring. Now before we open the lead-sealed vault on this, a quick reality check for the uninitiated. We're talking about historical negligence and modern-day fallout that isn't pretty. It's dark, it's frustrating, and frankly, it might make your blood boil. If you prefer your history sanitized and your water crystal clear, this isn't the channel for you. Viewer discretion is heavily advised. For the rest of you, welcome to the deep end. We're going to deconstruct the lies, the negligence, and the sheer audacity of powering a society on poison then and now. So, grab your investigative hats and maybe a bottle of genuinely safe water, because this is going to be a bumpy ride into the dark underbelly of public health disasters. Let's rewind. Victorian London, an age of empire, industry, and as it turns out, massive-scale lead pipes poisoning. Picture a sprawling, booming metropolis, the heart of the world's most powerful empire. But beneath its bustling streets lay a deadly secret, a vast network of service pipes made almost entirely of lead. Why lead? Because it was cheap, malleable, and abundant. It was the wonder material of the age, the plastic of the 19th century. If you were building a massive, groundbreaking water system to supply millions, you used lead. It seemed like common sense. But common sense, as we'll see, often collides with common ignorance. They didn't fully understand lead toxicity back then, at least not in the modern scientific sense. But here's the thing, they weren't completely clueless either. The debate on lead's effects was already simmering. Medical professionals in the 18th century like George Baker had identified Devonshire colic, a painful condition linked to drinking cider fermented in lead-lined vats. But translating that knowledge to a mass scale, to the very pipes delivering drinking water to every home, was a giant leap. By the early Victorian era, the connection was becoming harder to ignore. Doctors were reporting cases of unexplained colic, nerve damage, and cognitive decline, especially among those who consumed water from recently installed lead pipes. They even had a term for it, plumbism. But for a long time, these were seen as isolated incidents, not a systemic problem. Enter figures like Dr. John Snow, the pioneer of modern epidemiology, who famously mapped the Broad Street cholera outbreak and traced it to a contaminated water pump. While Snow's focus was bacterial contamination, other doctors were increasingly concerned about lead. One such voice was Dr. Angus Smith, a visionary chemist who coined the term acid rain and sounded early warnings about environmental pollution. Smith, along with other far-sighted individuals, recognized that the very characteristics of London's water were making the problem worse. The soft, acidic water flowing from sources like the Thames and the River Lee readily leached lead from the pipes. Imagine the dilemma. A massive infrastructure project costing countless millions, the pride of the nation, might be slowly poisoning everyone. The response? Not a massive recalls and replacement campaign. Instead, the narrative became one of minimization. Water companies, facing potentially astronomical costs for replacing miles of pipes, argued fiercely against the dangers. Some even suggested that lead was harmless in moderation, or that the danger was overblown. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The prevailing attitude was often one of fatalism and class division. The upper classes, who could afford elaborate filtration systems or private wells, were less affected. The poor, crowded into tenements with minimal sanitation and reliant on public pumps and shared lead plumbing, bore the brunt of it. Their complaints? Dismissed as symptoms of poverty or lack of hygiene. It took decades and a mounting body of scientific evidence for the tide to finally turn. In 1850, the General Board of Health, led by figures like Edwin Chadwick, published a landmark report on the nation's water supply. It wasn't a smoking gun on lead, focusing more on filth and sewage, but it did acknowledge the potential dangers of lead pipes. A turning point came in Leeds. In the mid-19th century, the city installed a new water supply system using lead pipes. almost immediately reports of lead poisoning soared. Local doctors were alarmed. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was an epidemic. This galvanized action. In Leeds, and eventually across the country, new regulations were introduced. Some local acts of parliament banned the use of lead pipes for new construction. It wasn't a universal solution, and existing lead pipes remained for generations, but it marked the beginning of the end for lead's dominance in water systems. So, while the Victorians may not have explicitly said, "keep drinking" in the face of absolute modern scientific proof, the initial denial, the minimization by industry interests, and the slow pace of change bear a chilling resemblance to later events. It was less of a conscious conspiracy and more of a collective blindness, fueled by economic considerations and a lack of scientific tools. But what happens when you do have the scientific tools, the modern regulations, and a clear understanding of toxicity, and yet the same disastrous script is followed? Enter Flint, Michigan. Now jump forward over a century and a half to 21st century America. To Flint, Michigan, a city that once boomed with automotive industry might, but now struggled with economic decline. And here, in a story that gripped the nation and exposed deep-seated failures in governance, the dynamic was shockingly different. In 2014, in a cost-cutting measure while under state-appointed emergency management, Flint's water source was switched from Detroit's water system, which used treated water from Lake Huron, to the local Flint River. This move, intended to save a few $1 million, set off a chain reaction of catastrophic failure. The key ingredient in this toxic stew wasn't just lead pipes. Flint still had many, like countless old American cities, but the water flowing through them. The Flint River water was significantly more corrosive than Lake Huron water. Crucially, the city, despite warnings from researchers and even its own employees, failed to add corrosion inhibitors, a simple and inexpensive step that had been standard practice for decades. Without these inhibitors, the corrosive river water aggressively attacked the protective layer that had built up inside the lead pipes, causing lead to leach directly into the drinking water. This wasn't a gradual problem, it was an immediate, high-dose contamination. Almost immediately after the switch, residents noticed changes. Their water smelled bad, tasted metallic, and sometimes came out discolored. Skin rashes and other health problems flared up. The response from officials? At first, it was standard reassurance. Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, MDEQ, officials claimed the water met all safety standards. Flint's mayor at the time, Dane Walling, even appeared on television drinking the water, trying to project confidence. The official message was, unmistakably, "keep drinking." While officials downplayed the crisis, independent researchers and community activists were sounding the alarm. This is where heroes emerge. Two key figures played a pivotal role in exposing the truth. First, Dr. Hanna-Attisha, a local pediatrician, became increasingly concerned about the sharp rise in elevated blood lead levels among children in Flint after the water switch. She meticulously analyzed blood test data and in 2015 released a shocking study confirming her fears. The lead levels were doubling and in some areas tripling, particularly in high-risk, low-income neighborhoods. Second, Dr. Mark Edwards, a renowned water quality expert from Virginia Tech, was invited by Flint residents to test their water. His findings were equally explosive. Some samples showed lead levels far exceeding the Environmental Protection Agency's EPA definition of toxic waste. Edwards and his team directly contradicted the MDEQ's data, accusing officials of using flawed testing methods to achieve passing results. Now we get to the heart of the keep drinking narrative in the modern era. Despite the mounting evidence, despite the residents' desperate pleas, and despite warnings from their own employees, top officials at the MDEQ and within the governor's office doubled down on denial. They attacked the credibility of the independent researchers. They dismissed the residents' complaints as anecdotal. They continued to issue reports claiming the water was safe. The governor's spokesperson even went so far as to call Dr. Hanna-Attisha an anti-science activist. The most damning evidence isn't what they said in public, but what they were communicating behind closed doors. Emails released later through FOIA requests and subsequent investigations paint a truly cynical picture. One high-ranking MDEQ official wrote, "It is clearly an issue of public perception, not a public health issue." Another dismissed the concerns about lead as an operational issue. This wasn't negligence, it was a deliberate attempt to manage optics over a serious public health crisis. The motivation? complex mix of political expediency, a desire to protect the initial cost-cutting decision, and a callous disregard for a vulnerable population. The combined pressure from the mounting scientific data, intense community activism, and explosive media attention finally became too great to ignore. In late 2015, Governor Rick Snyder finally acknowledged the crisis, declaring a state of emergency. Flint switched back to Detroit water shortly after, but the damage was done. A generation of children had been exposed to irreversible neurological damage, and trust in government was utterly shattered. So how do we compare these two events? On the surface, they seem radically different, a Victorian society with limited understanding versus a modern one with sophisticated knowledge. One driven by a new technological marvel versus one by cynical cost-cutting. Yet a deeper analysis reveals haunting parallels. 1. The profit over people problem. In Victorian England, the initial denial was driven by the immense costs water companies would face in replacing lead pipes. It was cheaper to downplay the risk or claim lead was harmless. In Flint, the decision to switch water sources and the refusal to add corrosion inhibitors was entirely about saving a relatively small amount of money, primarily benefiting the state-run emergency management and financial bottom line. 2. The marginalization of vulnerable populations. In both cases, the brunt of the poisoning fell disproportionately on low-income, predominantly working-class and minority communities. In Victorian London, it was the poor and crowded tenements. In Flint, it was a city that was majority African-American and had significant poverty rates. This isn't a coincidence. Studies consistently show that environmental hazards are concentrated in marginalized communities. Their voices are often ignored or dismissed, and they lack the political capital or financial resources to protect themselves. This is classic environmental racism in action. 3. The failure of checks and balances. Both stories showcase a failure of the systems designed to protect the public. In Victorian times, the regulatory framework was virtually non-existent. Water was private business, and public health was an afterthought. In Flint, the failure was systemic at multiple levels. Local officials who should have known better, a state environmental agency that seemed more concerned with compliance than safety, and a state government that prioritized financial austerity over human well-being. The very institutions designed to be watchdogs either fell asleep at the wheel or worse, actively participated in the deception. 4. The invisible nature of the threat. Unlike a cholera outbreak with its immediate and violent symptoms, lead poisoning is a silent and subtle assassin. The damage isn't immediately obvious, especially at lower levels of exposure. This makes it easier to deny and harder to rally public outrage until it's far too late. The cognitive decline, the behavioral issues, the long-term health problems, these aren't headline-grabbing events like an explosion or a plane crash. This invisibility is a critical factor in how these crises are prolonged. It creates a window of time for officials to muddy the waters, literally and figuratively, issue platitudes, and hope the problem disappears or is attributed to something else. So what have we learned? The stories of Victorian London and Flint, Michigan aren't just tragic footnotes in history, they are powerful allegories for our time. They remind us that progress isn't linear, that scientific knowledge doesn't automatically translate to protective action, and that vigilance against corporate and governmental negligence is essential. The Victorian era, despite its flaws, did eventually start replacing lead pipes. It was slow and painful, but there was a recognizable, if belated, attempt to fix the problem. In Flint, the response was marked by outright deception and a shocking lack of accountability. It took heroic acts by outsiders to force a reckoning. The question isn't if authorities will know the water is poison. It's a sad reality that historical precedent says they very well might. The real question is, when they do, what will we do about it? Will we be like the Victorian public, often too poor, too powerless, or too preoccupied with other struggles to demand change? Or will we be like the activists and whistleblowers of Flint, refusing to accept the official lie and fighting for the fundamental right to clean water? The fight for environmental justice didn't end in 19th century London, and it certainly didn't end in Flint. This is our problem. This is our time. So the next time someone tells you to keep drinking in the face of concerning evidence, remember the lessons of historical detective. Ask hard questions. Demand the data. And most importantly, listen to the marginalized voices who are often the first and loudest to signal the danger. Because the truth about what we're consuming, and who's letting us consume it, is a mystery that deserves to be solved. Until next time, this is the Historical Detective signing off. Stay curious, stay informed, and never stop investigating the poisons that hide in plain sight.